So another request from Patreon. This one's on the topic of type service. Can you rely on it? Is it helpful? What are the caveats? And if applicable, are there any warning signs that you can look for in determining whether or not a type service is going to be worth your time? And are there any instances in which a person might just be looking to take advantage of you? Well, first of all, I want to say that finding your true personality type, your true cognitive type, it often takes some time. It often takes some patience. And I get why in many instances you might just feel impatient. You might just want the result. You might just want the answer. You might just want to receive a completely reliable determinant of your true type. And while, of course, I do not divulge any information about my clients, I have had occasions whereby a person has come up to me and they just want absolute certainty so that they can move on to the next logical step, and that is applying their type code towards their own self-growth. And I'm happy to say that in those instances, I have been able to provide to a client a type code with a high degree of certainty. But the fact is, the concept of cognitive type is often not anywhere near as clear-cut as this 4x4 matrix, this 16 personality system makes it out to be. Because so many people, especially oftentimes the people who feel very uncertain of their type even after years of study, really do belong towards the very edge of any given type spectrum. Let's say, you have a cake and you cut it up into 16 parts. Well, some people, sure, they're going to be right in the cozy middle of any one of those segments. But some people really are going to be towards the very edge of any one of those slices. So much so that they can actually be verging on being another type entirely. For example, some people's auxiliary function is going to be rotating with the dominant quite often. An INTJ has ISFP moments, vice versa. An ISTP has plenty of INFJ moments, and ENTJ has plenty of ESFP moments. The list goes on. And this is just to point out some people are naturally harder to type, or even harder to self-type than other people. For example, some people's cognition is just very fluid and interchanging. Another person's magnitude of the dominant function is so neutral that they seem very much in between two types. For example, in between an ISTJ and an INTJ. Other people's cognitive orientations are so neutral as to be almost ambiverted in nature. Some ENFPs are practically on the cusp of being an INFJ. Some ESFPs practically on the cusp of being an ISFJ. And I don't say this to deter people from seeking out a type service. In fact, it is in these instances when a type service might be even more valuable to you, because it requires the nuanced understanding of someone who's been doing this for a long time, who's honed their instrument over the course of many, many clients. I have to mention the fact that recently I only just got it right. It was a very challenging experience. I had to do a lot of additional reflection. And it's also worth mentioning that last year when I was first starting the service, I actually typed a couple of people wrong. And while the clients themselves, having received their correct type thereafter, have been nothing but courteous and kind, I do feel a certain level of regret. Regret that I could not have been better. But since recently I've been typing to a high degree of accuracy, I want to let you know that I'm not making this video in order to justify any recent mistakes, but rather just to point out on behalf of myself and other typologists, occasionally the difficulty level of any given client spikes through the roof. And I do want to run with that analogy for a little bit, because some clients, some people, at least from my perspective, are very, very easy to type. And there's a level of self-reporting error that can go in here as well, of course, because some clients don't always give the answers to questions that in hindsight they would have wanted to give. Some people have fitted themselves into an archetype and are so aware of the cognitive functions that they subconsciously steer you towards a result which doesn't actually correspond to their true cognitive type. And I guess some people will be more easily steered in this regard than others. Because at the end of the day, human beings are highly, highly complicated entities. So yeah, I don't know how many of you are gamers, but some of the difficulty settings are very easy, and then some of the difficulties go all the way up to insane. But all of these difficulty settings come with an Iron Man or hardcore mode, and that means you don't get to reload your game. As this is real life, you get one chance to give your client the correct result. So you better make sure you are as objective as you possibly can be when typing your client. So disclaimer number one, you do not pay for a type result. You pay for an informed opinion on what your type is most likely to be. And many practitioners, including myself, provide a secondary type. If the first type is the type you are most likely to be, the second type is your second most likely. But I must stress it is an informed opinion, and it is based upon the information that is presented. In my type service basic, for example, I form a result based upon email correspondence. There's no micro expression. There's no extroverted feeling nuance that I can pick up on. And there's no perception of how the person is actually thinking about an answer in the first place. And while I have had a lot of accuracy within that particular service, for good reason, most people opt for tier 1 and tier 2 because those packages include video call. And that does allow me, especially if the person allows me to, for research purpose only, record the video call, an additional supply of data which is very helpful for determining a person's cognitive predisposition. And when bringing this primary disclaimer into perspective, it can be quite helpful to see a type service is not a means by which to acquire your type to almost 99% certainty, but rather an informed opinion that can very much catapult you much further along in your type journey. It's a means to save time. Because whereas finding one's type may take years upon years of study, engaging with a high quality type service of somebody who you trust can expedite the process to such an extent as to, if it hasn't already given you your type to a high degree of certainty, which it often can, by the way, put you in such an informed position so that you only need a few more months of study to not only arrive at your true type, but have such confidence in that type result and such knowledge of the cognitive functions that you know from that point onwards that you could not be any other type. That is the type that you are. Not only that, but this is the specific region you fit within that particular piece of the cake. And perhaps from that point, you may even notice the fact that you're not always in that same position. Because the process of finding your type is an ongoing journey, because once you know your type, you can begin to observe how that type fluctuates, not only within that particular slice of cake, but within the cake as a whole. Forgive the crude analogy, but my birthday is coming up, so I'm thinking about cake quite a bit. So yes, you are paying for an informed opinion, and oftentimes that opinion is going to give you your correct type. But even if you do not get the same type, so long as a typologist has been reasonable, has fully explained things to you, and hasn't been overly zealous in telling you what type you absolutely must be, you would have gained much more information about yourself. And that information will put you much, much, much further ahead on your type journey than you often would have been beforehand. So just to reiterate, a type service is a supplement towards a type journey. It is not the type journey in and of itself. Because even once you've received your type, there's still a journey after that. The second disclaimer is type service still relies to an extent on self-reporting, and that can skew the results. I don't say this in order to put myself above anybody else. I don't say this in order to make my type service seem superior, but I am fortunate enough to have a natural cognition that picks up quite easily on microtransactions. And as such, the CPT type service actually observes the way in which you are thinking. So even if a person gives me answers which are contrary to their actual cognition, I can quite often pick up on the underlying cognition behind the answer. And this is why I often stress to people the importance of a video call, because it gives me that extra amount of visual information. And I'm not talking about visual cues, okay? There is a certain correlation with a person's eye movement, with a person's body language, and their actual type, but it is unreliable because all of these patterns can be learned and unlearned over time. But I do still incorporate a level of visual cues into the service, but that information is used alongside in conjunction with the other information ascertained. So when I talk about how a person is visually expressing their cognitive makeup, I'm talking also about the tempo of their speech. How much time they're taking between one word and another, one sentence and another. What is being enunciated? What is not? What answers to which questions are driving out a certain kind of emotional response? How do they respond to certain things? While I'm not an MBTI practitioner, while I do not adhere fully to this idea that all values and perception can be directly correlated with underlying cognitive functions, as there is nonetheless a small correlation between both of these factors, this is also entering the play. I also try and look for what you value, how you perceive certain forms of reality. But nonetheless, even with all of this additional information supplied, I must still stress to you the importance of being as objective and as honest as you possibly can, because at the end of the day, you have purchased this service, and any dishonesty or lack of objectivity on your part can very much skew the results, or at the very least make it a lot harder for the practitioner to get you those correct results. And of course there will be some instances, although I've yet to encounter them, where a person is so set on being one type that the practitioner-client process will be just an ongoing battle of trying to convince the client they are a type they do not believe themselves to be. And in those instances, you have to ask, Why did you buy the service in the first place? Because it obviously wasn't to receive your correct result. And this is where I must stress, if you do purchase a CPT type service, I'm not interested in giving you the result you were most happy with. I'm not going to lie to you to make you feel better or to allow you to continue living a lie. I want to empower you. I want to give you the means to overcome your type, to use your cognitive stack to your fullest extent. I can't do this if I give you a type which I do not believe you to be. So I guess as a disclaimer on the back of this one, I have to say, make sure you are going into a type service for the right reasons. Disclaimer number 3, not all systems are equal. Different systems employ different definitions and versions of cognitive functions. They have different interpretations of what a cognitive type is in the first place. I've had clients who have received a socionics result. As far as socionics goes, it was the correct result. Whoever typed them did a very good job. However, a socionics type does not correspond to an MBTI type and certainly does not correspond to a CPT type. This is because socionics cognitive functions have a behavioral element. It's not just about what cognitive functions you have, it's about how you are expressing these functions. MBTI and CPT are more or less closely related. If you know your CPT type, you probably know your MBTI type, and sometimes vice versa too. The socionics is on a slightly different level to these two systems. I had a live stream of Jack, socionics practitioner, last year. He's a very nice guy. We had a really good, mutually beneficial discussion. We actually realized there's a lot of overlap between each of our systems. But the emphasis of the systems is completely different. The use of terminology to refer to a specific thing is very different. A cognitive type to one person will be a very different thing to another. So when you are going into a type service, be very mindful of the system you are going to be using. If you are only interested in socionics, then get your socionics type. Don't look at other types because your socionics type, it might, but more often than not, it probably won't correspond to your MBTI type. I'm happy to say that a type code given to you from CPT will pretty much overlap 100% with that from MBTI. The reason CPT does not use MBTI is because I believe CPT is a truer expression of what's actually going on in the cognitive makeup of a person. Whereas in terms of socionics or something more comparable to that system, it's a great system, but it won't necessarily overlap 100% with what would be your correct type within a more MBTI-like paradigm. And disclaimer number 4, know your practitioner. Make sure it's somebody you trust. Make sure it's somebody who you know will put a lot of thought and maybe even go the extra mile into making sure they give you as good a service as they possibly can. And so it's fair to say I have a level of bias as well. If I was going to say, well, choose this person over the other one. Go with this typologist and not with that one. But I would say generally be very mindful of confidence, because I have noticed a certain pattern whereby people who seem very zealous, people who seem extremely confident in their instrument to the extent that they will quite happily dismiss any other instrument that does not correspond to their own, seem to have not only a certain level of confirmation bias, but also a significant lack of that healthy self-critical attitude which is necessary to refine and grow an instrument over time, to continue developing, to continue enhancing your system. And perhaps on top of all of that, with a kind of cherry on the cake, make sure the person has a level of humility too. Because a humble practitioner is more likely to put in that additional hour's work, is more likely to go above and beyond the call of duty. Because it is that awareness of one's own weaknesses, one's capacity for human error, which will actually almost paradoxically ensure that that error never occurs. Because a humble practitioner is perfectionistic. They do not feel entirely worthy of the money you are giving them. And I guess I'd say on the back of that, don't be fooled by false confidence either. Because oftentimes it's a front put on to make up for a severe lack of confidence in not only one's own system, but one's own abilities. And if such a lack of confidence, of course, which is not necessarily a bad thing at all, is unconscious, it would not necessarily be as readily used in a constructive manner. And it could actually be more detrimental than it is beneficial, for example, resulting in a certain confirmation bias. So I hope that cleared things up for people, even though I benefit, I guess, from people purchasing the type service, from people seeing the type service as the only means by which they can actually find their true type. It would be very dishonest of me to say anything along those lines, because the fact is a type service is a supplement. Yes, it can sometimes give you certainty, but ultimately, even if it gives you the correct type, the certainty in that type is something you must acquire yourself. anyone who's seeking a type service just so they don't have to think about it anymore, I'd say they are approaching it from the wrong angle. Because once you receive your correct type from a typologist, there's still a lot more work to do. You must come to your own understanding of that type and how you fit within it, how that type applies to you. The journey does not end with you finding your type. And being more supplemental in nature, a type service should be more seen as something which can expedite your typing journey, rather than this absolute instrument that can provide to you your type with more than 95% certainty. And if anybody's claiming more than 95% accuracy in their instrument, I'd be very, very cautious. And I would say in these instances, such an instrument is more likely designed to wedge people into the person's specific system than it is to correspond the person to their own individual cognition. And while this video is no way intended as an advert for my own type service, I guess now is an appropriate time to say, if you are interested in finding your type or coming to your own understanding of what your type is, I highly recommend checking out the CPT type service. And just as a small segue, there are sometimes instances where I feel like I have an opportunity to capitalize on another person's insecurity or their uncertainty. There's a lot of ways to make money off people's negative emotional states, people's identity problems, people's trauma that they've experienced in their lives. And there's so much opportunity to exploit people, I feel. And that's just not something I'm interested in any way, shape or form. Yeah, it's easy to make a few bucks, if you like, off the back of someone who's struggling. But if you're not here to help people, then what's the point? The greatest benefit of doing psychology, I'm sure it can pay well, but I don't care how suppressed your emotions are, there's no way you're going to feel good about yourself if for all of the money you've made, you've never truly helped someone, or you make money literally from taking advantage of another person's insecurity or identity crisis. Because then you're not a psychologist, you have no right to take pride in your work, you're just a con artist. And ultimately the greatest joy that comes from this line of work is not from the money, although that's obviously a necessary compensation for time invested in many cases. No, it's from the positive impact you can have on the world around you through enhancing and enriching the lives of others. So yeah, I guess, although I don't necessarily know any specific cases, I have to point out there is an opportunity here to essentially prey upon others and to take advantage of a person's uncertainty as to their type code, to send them on a wild goose chase, just to line this person's pocket. But as for those people who of course do exist, they are often deeply sad and unhappy individuals. And if you are ever exploited by such a person, take a certain solace in knowing that as much as this person is taken from you, they are still far more empty and unhappy than you will ever be. So I hope that was informative. Thank you so much for watching, and if you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it. If you haven't already checked out the CPT ebook, I highly recommend you do so. People have really enjoyed it and found it very informative. And just a final call to action, CPT is now on Patreon. The community is actually growing quite nicely at the moment, and I'm really grateful to everyone who supported CPT in this additional medium. And so if you yourself are interested in supporting the theory and the channel on that additional level, it would be massively appreciated too. So thank you again for watching, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.